So, why self-compassion? And before I do that, I'd actually like this to be an interactive talk. So, what do you know about self-compassion, and why are you drawn here? What is it that makes you do?
I think I've been struggling tremendously with, you do 20 things, 19 of them great, and that one thing, not good, needs work, and allowing that to kind of absorb all of my energy.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Rick Hansen speaks to that in his Buddha's Brain, that you have Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones, and it's so true. It's just we gravitate towards negativity for some strange reason in terms of the power of remembrance. Yeah. How about you, Durst?
I would say I was raised by an authority figure who prohibited self-compassion, but he didn't do it out loud. And it took a couple decades to get out from under that prohibition, or even to realize it was there.
Yeah. Julia? I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Arunima, yes. And where are you, Arunima?
Sorry, did you say where am I?
Are you to be compassionate for others? There's an outpouring that comes naturally from our heart place when we see another in distress. The root of compassion is really to suffer with. I think it's important to recognize what it is not, because there can be an association with self-compassion as being in some way self-indulgent or selfish, and it's not. It's not wallowing. It's not selfishness. It's not self-centeredness. And so I think it really bears repeating so that it can free us from that taint of believing that we're being self-indulgent. As you were saying, Petra, it really is an essential practice. Ideally, I think all of us want to live our lives from that place of integrity, from that place where we're fully who we are, without all of the taints of our history, without the taints of our society, our environment when we were growing up, all the ways in which we have been impacted to respond in the world and be out in the world in a way that doesn't necessarily truly reflect our true nature. And self-compassion, as you're mentioning, can be one of the avenues that allows us to return to that place of, you can call it your God self, your Buddha nature, true nature, whatever you think of as that essential nature, which is our birthright, which is, in a way, probably how we came into this world to be. So self-compassion, the practice, literally the practice of self-compassion, can return us to coming back to living more from that place than we have in the past. And I think I will, since there's so many ICP people here, I think I will go through the stages of internships, which is, you come to school and you learn a lot about psychotherapy. And at the end of your 3 years training, you've done a practicum. So you've had a little bit of experience with actually sitting in the chair of a therapist and practicing self-compassion, I hope, but particularly practicing compassion for your clients. And there's something wonderfully exhilarating and freeing, and it's if psychotherapy is in fact your calling, or coaching, or anything in which you're relating to other people, compassion is a natural part of who you are. I don't think you would be drawn to this profession if that were not true. On the other hand, self-compassion is often very shy in that. And depending on our makeup, there are certain gifts that you bring to the profession. Psychotherapy is a wonderful balance. The practice of psychotherapy is a wonderful balance between the right brain and the left brain. It's the right brain intuition, it's the right brain tuning into people, it's the right brain seeing the whole context of the picture, being able to get the whole framework of what this person is talking to you about. And the left brain in terms of organizing schedules, doing marketing, doing billing, all the things that are an essential part of the practice of psychotherapy. And depending on which you come in with, one part of it is easy for you and the other is challenging, or the other way around. I had an intern in my practice who was a previous business manager, and she found the administrative part of it really, really easy. But the emotional waves which came through her as she was working with clients as a result of her own issues coming up were a little more challenging for her to deal with. It's more often the other way around, that people are more at ease with recognizing when they have been impacted by clients, knowing when it is time for them to do something about it, and seeking help. Just put something different. So, to go through the stages of internship, you've graduated, you've done your practicum, and then you move out, and there's a feeling of, thank goodness, I'm qualified, now I can practice, now I can go out and do therapy. Only to find out that there is another hurdle in terms of the internship before you become finally licensed. And that is an essential part of the training of becoming a psychotherapist, because a lot of unseen issues, a lot of challenges come up in that, not only because of your own interactions with clients, because you're having to discover your own skills, discover the places where you need more training, discovering the places where you are, because of your own history challenged, but also because you have to deal with, if you're in an agency, you deal with the regulations of the agency, you deal with timing and scheduling of rooms, you deal with a lot of paperwork, and so there can be a sense of feeling, yes, I graduated, but I'm still a child, I'm still an infant, I'm still under somebody's regulations. And I have a current intern who disagreed with the policy of the agency, which is very strict in terms of missed sessions are paid for, and you have to come every week. And if you don't come every week, you have to pay for sessions. Well, she had personal difficulty with that, and so she discovered that she wasn't actually making it evident that that was the regulation, even though they did have a sheet and they did read it and they saw what was written down. But when it came time for her to impose that, she realized that she was skirting it because of her own disagreements with the policy of the agency. And so personal things like that can come up. You come to recognize the learning is that, yes, you are the therapist to this client, but sometimes maintaining the frame of the therapeutic relationship can hold more importance than what would normally be considered a compassionate response. And so those differentiations can bring a lot of difficulties in terms of how do you relate to that? And what does it bring up for you? And why is it difficult for you to impose that? What is it about your history that makes it difficult to impose that? And that's an opportunity, that's one of the opportunities for self-compassion. It's like, if you were to relate to that as just, oh, it's their problem, then you have friction, then there's difficulty. But if you relate to it, okay, so what is this in me that's coming up that's causing this? Then there's movement, then there's potential for movement. And the potential for movement comes with both several steps. One is honesty about what is coming up. Oh, this is difficult for me. One is the honesty of exploring it. And then thirdly is the recognition of what it is in you that has been triggered, and bringing compassion to that particular place. It's like, oh, that's right. This reminds me of whatever it was. And, oh, I'm so sorry that came up. How can I work with it? Rather than flailing yourself or saying, why am I being so obtuse, or whatever it is you might say to yourself, because the internal dialogue can really be quite vicious, as I'm sure all of you recognize in being here tonight. So another way it can come up is in having an issue with the content of what a client may be bringing to you. For example, another intern recently had a situation where he was seeing an individual who was having an affair, and she said, oh, I'm thinking of leaving my husband, and I just it's not working. And in exploring this, coming to recognize, the intern came to recognize that he actually had a bias against her leaving her husband because of something that had happened to him in his own therapy years ago. And that may have been impacting the way in which he was relating to the client. So there again is another opportunity for self-compassion to come in. It's easy to go immediately to, oh gosh, I'm wrong, I did that wrong. Rather than, oh, I wonder what that's about. And being able to bring it into a much larger context, in seeing it in a bigger context, can allow that self-compassion to flood in, can allow you to bring a sense of loving kindness to yourself, as opposed to, oh, I got it wrong again, or whatever your internal self-talk is. So those are some of the stages that you go through in an internship. And then finally, at the end, having negotiated all these hours, done all the various juggling acts that you have to do in terms of time and supervision, getting the correct hours for whichever sequence that you need to get it in, getting your children's hours, your couple's hours, passing the exam, and then finally, at the end of it, feeling a little bit like a neophyte again by having to take yet another exam after having practiced for 3,000 hours. It's a long process. It's a necessary process, but it's a long process. And it really does elicit opportunities that are endless for self-compassion. I'm sure I can see some smiling, so I bet there's some resonance in this room for some of the things that you've probably had to deal with already. So what is compassion? Compassion can be described as I mentioned before, suffering with. And in suffering with, in order to do it really accurately, you have to be able to embody in a physiological sense that which your patient is going through, not to take it on. It's a strange mixture, not to take it on as yours, but to really understand it from a limbic resonance place. Are you familiar with limbic resonance? Okay. From a mirror neuron place. And if you're, to the extent that we are able as therapists to do that, the client, in recognizing that, almost has to shift, because two people can't stay in the same place at the same time. And so if you have the capacity to embody that, then it's inevitable that the client feels seen, heard, understood in a deeply visceral way, and is then able to move on. There's something about the recognition of understanding, true, deep, profound understanding, that facilitates the therapeutic process. But in order to do that, you need to be able to know that in yourself. So how do you get to know it in yourself? By self-compassion. That is one of the best ways. In a sense, we cannot truly be compassionate with our clients unless we are deeply self-compassionate. It's a way in which we learn not only about ourselves, but we learn about humanity in general. We learn about, frailties of human nature and the various ways in which humans respond to life in general. So with that, I'd like to actually skip a little bit and move into an interactive exercise, and then come back to compassion, self-compassion in particular, from a way in which you know it from a deeper place. So I'd like you to just take a moment to think about a time when you felt compassionate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be compassionate to yourself. It can be compassionate to somebody else. So just I'll leave you, just take a moment and maybe jot a few notes if you feel like it. So you get a felt sense of what compassion is in your body. Think of, each of you mentioned your own self-talk. Now, bring up a time recently when you were aware that your internal dialogue was self-destructive, that you were criticizing yourself, that you were diminishing yourself, that you were doing something in a way that was not creative, not helpful, not moving you towards your well-being. Do you have a sense of that? Okay. And then I'd like you to divide up into dyads, if you wouldn't mind, and share with each other, one, the example that you gave, what your internal self-talk was, and then how you might be if you were to change from believing it or going with it to bringing self-compassion into it. And it might be something as simple as acknowledging it. Sometimes just the witnessing of what's going on allows the intensity and the sharpness to dissipate. It may mean more than that. It may mean soothing, self-soothing. And again, we'll go back into how to self-soothe later. But do what you did with the other person that you're compassionate with to yourself. See if you can bring that to yourself. Does that make sense? So as you initially brought up a sense of you felt compassion, what might you say to that person? How might you behave to that person? Might it be, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Can I help you in any way? Or it may be, oh, wow, that must really have hurt. Here, let me do something for you. Or is there any way that I can help? So the things that you would normally do, see if you can bring that quality of compassion to yourself, and how would that be? What are the kinds of things that would need to happen in order for you to accept that, for one thing? Recognize that it's necessary, accept it, and allow yourself to do it, which is the heart of self-compassion. Does that make sense? Sure.
Can you clarify one thing a little more? A few minutes ago you said have compassion without taking it on. And I realized I never thought of those as different. Is there a way you could say a little more what you mean?
Yes, yes. Did I say have compassion without taking it on?
Or something close to that.
Something close to that.
Mm-hmm.
I meant have compassion without actually being subsumed by the experience of the person for whom you have compassion.
Yeah, how do you not be subsumed?
How do you not be subsumed? Part of it is practice. It's really by maintaining a larger context. You recognize that you're you, and this person is this person, and that they are experiencing this in a temporary time place. That it's not their whole life. It's not. They're hurting. They're in pain. They're in agony at this particular moment in their life. But they had a life before after, but this is, you're looking at a particular context of their life and recognizing that what you're seeing is not all of who they are, that there is also their spirituality that has an impact in it, their family has an impact in it, their friends have an impact in it, that you're not the sole person who is responsible for this person. And there's something about recognizing the interconnectedness of the world in general and of you with this person that allows you a level of ability to be there with them without becoming subsumed by their distress. Also maintaining that connection with yourself. That's the mainly important one. But to the extent that you can maintain a connection with yourself, you can then expand and allow pretty much anything in by being maintained in your own integrity. So, yeah. Does that help a little bit?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So if you'd like to just divide up into pairs then, what happened, or anything that you've learned, anything that you discovered, what was prominent for you?
Part of what's just helpful for me was just hearing.
Yes, yeah. That's
really helpful.
Self-compassion is to recognize that.
Yeah.
I guess just being present to the challenges of being compassionate with someone you see is suffering, especially if it's your own family member, and there's no way, because that person doesn't want to admit that they're suffering.
Yes.
Or is not open to receiving your compassion.
Yeah.
And that where do you go with that when you feel it and you can't communicate about it with them? Because you're like, well, I'm fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And did you explore where to go with it in your dialogue?
Not really. I'm just explaining the situation.
So that's,
The difficulty of it.
yeah, it is. It's a challenging situation. But there again, that's a perfect opportunity to bring in self-compassion. How hard it is for me to witness this and not be able to do anything about it. That's an opportunity to bring self-compassion in. But what do I need to be able to sustain myself so that I can witness this, recognizing that there's nothing that I can do about it? How can I soothe myself in this challenging situation? So it is a perfect time because you're in discomfort. And compassion is an open-hearted, felt-sense response to a being in distress or discomfort. In this instance, the other person is really suffering, but you're also suffering in that you're unable to do anything about it. And that's a form of suffering. So to then, again, bring the compassion to yourself. How would that be for you to do that?
Well, I have to just have time and place to practice that.
Yeah.
But definitely, if I did that more, then I could just say, this is yours, and I'm in this other space.
Yes.
And I can still bring love and
Yes.
sharing
Yes.
and just acceptance that, okay, if you say it's fine, then it's fine.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Try to go there.
Yes.
It's too difficult.
It's part of the serenity prayer, to recognize that which we can change and to know that which we can't, and to know the difference. And there's something about the acceptance that will be required there, knowing that there is nothing that you can do, if in fact there isn't. Yeah. Anyone else like to share?
I feel like the only times I'm able to really have self-compassion is if I take myself to being a little girl.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because I'm very passionate about children and the health and well-being of children.
Yes.
And I see every child as innocent.
Yes.
And I have to take my myself back to a place of seeing myself as a little girl to really have self-compassion. Other than that, I don't have it in the sense of because you're older, you should know better now. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
you should be able to protect yourself from these things, and you should, you know, all these shoulds because you're at a certain point in life.
Mm-hmm.
But when I go back to a child and know that no matter what, a child deserves love and caring and
Yes.
support and nurturing, it's easier for me to let myself have that.
Yes. What a wonderful way to bring in self-compassion. Because you can then say, okay, so what would I say to this little child if they were suffering down there? And then bring it back into yourself. Yeah, that's a wonderful way of doing it. It's actually an easier way to access self-compassion sometimes is to imagine that this is happening to a little child and then bring it back.
Unfortunately, I can't access that enough.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah.
And the other point that you bring up too is more often than not, and this is a broad stroke generalization, when we're suffering, we're very often in a regressed state, so that actually is accurate. You know, particularly when we're ill. It often brings up our feelings of dependence on other people, which takes us immediately back to our infantile selves. So quite often when we are suffering, we are in a regress state. So it's really appropriate to do it that way. Anything else?
I shared that it was very difficult to slow down the process of how I'm compassionate to others because it's so automatic.
Yes. Yeah.
And how difficult it was to identify specifically the negative self-talk because that is so automatic.
Yes.
It's almost like they're spinning in opposite directions, and it's so old.
Yes.
I don't even know where it began.
Yeah.
It's so constant.
That's right. It's so old, it's so familiar, and quite often it's almost like this dull monotone that continues, almost like a radio station that's on, you know, very, very gently. So it's there all the time and it has an impact on us, but we don't bring it to awareness. And that's actually the first part of self-compassion, is almost a critical honesty with what's going on, because it can be very disorienting and disturbing to notice how severe our internal criticism is. You know, we don't sometimes even want to recognize how bad it is. We would never, ever say to other people what we say to ourselves, ever. I mean, we can be really quite brutal with our internal self-talk. Yeah, so it sounds as if you really did get an understanding of what it would be like to be able to bring that home to yourself. I'm referring you 3 books, actually, if you'd like to just help yourself to one of these and pass them on. And an article on compassion fatigue, which really addresses people who are in the healthcare professions. In her book, Kristen F. talks about 3 ways of, there are 2 books here which you can, hers is called Self-Compassion, and Christopher Germer's The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. Kristen F's is a fairly fast read introduction to self-compassion. Christopher Germer goes a lot into more of the underlying mindfulness challenges that we have in bringing self-compassion in and making it part of our daily practice, really, because we have opportunities multiple times a day to practice it. So Chris defines self-compassion in 3 different ways, or she suggests that there are 3 aspects. I think there probably may be more, but this is a good synopsis. The first one is bringing kindness and gentle understanding into ourselves. There's a recognition that everyone has something about themselves which they don't like, that something that causes them to feel shame or insecure or not good enough, that it's the human condition to be imperfect. If you think of imperfect as things that are undesirable. Feelings of failure and inadequacy are part of the experience of human life. But in order to really operate well in the world, we have to remember what they tell you in airlines. You know, you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on somebody else. And that's the equivalent of bringing self-compassion in before you can then move out into the world and be compassionate. The Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. It's, and there's several ways in which you can physically practice compassion, which I'll show you here. One of the ways that's used with the veterans when they come home is that our body, for some reason, doesn't differentiate between when somebody else is holding us and when we're holding ourselves. So what they're using with the vets coming home is the hug. And you can wrap your arms around and feel your shoulders, in particular if you can stroke your back. And there's something about the soothing nature of that one of the vets, when he was taught this, and he really closed his eyes and got into feeling, you know, and he feeling the comfort that came with it, said, I don't ever want to move my arms. You know, this is so comforting. And so that's one of the ways that we can hug ourselves. We can bring, especially when something has hurt us that's sort of sudden and, you know, it's like, oh, I just need a hug. That's a great way of doing it. Another way that's taught in the Buddhist tradition is holding your heart. Again, as I mentioned, the heart doesn't know that somebody else isn't holding it. And just literally putting your right hand over your heart. And you can try this now. And notice what you feel. And it's particularly, it actually changes your physiology. If you were wired up to electrodes now, what would happen is you would see that your pulse rate comes down, your blood pressure generally goes down, and you move into a much more sympathetic relaxation state of being. Especially if you hold your hand there until you can actually feel the pulse of your heart on your hand. So it's like feeling your own heart. It has a tremendously soothing effect. That's another way of bringing compassion to yourself. When you recognize that you're really agitated or anxious or frustrated, or you just need soothing. This is a wonderful way of soothing yourself. A third way, which is probably the fastest way of moving from your sympathetic to your parasympathetic nervous system, is to just take 3 deep breaths. So before you do that, scan your body and have a sense. Just do a quick body scan and sense what your level of calmness, attention, beingness is. And then just take 3 deep, slow breaths and notice the difference. Well, what did you notice, if anything?
I think with myself, because I already kind of have a pressure there, like a stress pressure, it took me a little while to just feel my hand there.
Yes.
Just to get through the congestion or that stress.
Yeah. It can sometimes take a while, especially if we're very, very agitated. It takes a while to soothe. What you were saying, too, goes along with the fact that one of the fastest ways to de-stress is exercise. And in exercise, we're forced to take deep breaths. And it really does. There's a direct correlation between mind chatter and frequency of exercise. The more we exercise, the lower our level of mind chatter. So exercise is another wonderful way of bringing self-compassion in. So the second part of Chris Niff's illustration of self-compassion is what you were addressing, Julia, which is common humanity. Quite often when we insult ourselves, and I'm going to use that word intentionally, we tend to move into the place of, I'm the only one that's ever done this, and feel very alone. There's an isolation that comes with, if, for example, we're embarrassed, we, at a party, fall over and spill something. There's a level of embarrassment. And it's almost as if I'm responsible for this and I'm the only one that does this, and I'm feeling, how could I do this? Why should I be so clumsy? It's very much an isolated incident, rather than recognizing that everyone does that. And there's something in recognizing the common humanity that can soften it. You can feel that even as I said it. It sort of softens the vigilance of our self-abnegation. Yeah. It's the human condition to err, and we are who we are. The other part of common humanity is to recognize that we are who we are, not because we've designed ourselves necessarily that way, but as I mentioned earlier, we come through our inheritance, we come through our childhood, we are who we are as a result of our culture. And various cultures, as you mentioned earlier, relate very differently to a being in the world, how to relate to each other. That the Dalai Lama had no concept of not being good enough or being inadequate, because he wasn't raised that way. If we were raised that way, how different would we be? So to recognize the common humanity within particularly the Western world, because that's where we are, and how much it emphasizes that, as you were saying. It takes 10 good events to erase one bad one, whereas the opposite is true. We remember 10 bad events and don't remember the good one. It's almost an inverse proportion. So we're weighted to criticize ourselves as opposed to recognize our innate goodness and our innate humanity. The third aspect of self-compassion is mindfulness. And we've talked a lot about that. That was really what the exercise was about, is that the distress is often caused by internal responses which feel unpleasant or undesirable. And quite often our response to unpleasant internal responses is, oh, go away, as opposed to, oh, I'm so sorry, which is the opposite, which is the compassion, bringing compassion to it. It's bringing acceptance. It's recognition, but it's also acceptance. We can recognize something but not necessarily accept it. But to accept that which is true for us, even if it isn't something that we necessarily want to believe is true about us. It may be something that we don't identify as being who we are, for example, like if we have been mean or slighted someone. We don't necessarily want to think, oh gosh, I'm really an unkind person, rather than, or reframe it to that, wow, that was an unkind event, rather than I'm an unkind person. But to own it as, in this event, I was unkind, to own it and to bring self-compassion to it. Again, remembering that every act that we have is universal, and to hold it in a larger context. This was only one event in my life. And as humor is a great addition to self-compassion in this context. If you do something which you would prefer that you hadn't done, or which you'd rather you had not done, is to not necessarily condone it, but to sort of detoxify it. One of my friends says one of her ways of detoxifying is to say, well, did anyone lose a limb as a result of that? And that immediately puts it into context. So step back and disidentify with it, and see it in the larger context. Was this really, really awful? Or was it just something that I can learn from, and I would choose not to do it again if I had the opportunity, to use it as a learning? And to bring forgiveness. The other aspect of self-compassion is to bring forgiveness to ourselves, that in any given moment in our lives, we're really doing the best that we can, and to recognize that. And in the ultimate forgiveness is to let go of any hopes of a better past. We can always shift in the future, but if we can let go of any hopes of a better past, acknowledging that that was so, and letting it go, then that's also a way of bringing compassion to ourselves. I realize that we're just about out of time, so I think what I'd like to do is to end with a poem. So in that case, I can run down a few ways of increasing self-compassion, a few things that you might do, apart from the physical things, which is to take a situation that's challenging for you right now, and imagine that a good friend, having just heard about your dilemma, you just told them about this situation, is writing to you. What would he or she say? And to actually write it out. There's something about the actual physical writing of it that's really helpful. Sounds as if you two may have done that. Bring awareness. Another one is bringing awareness to the ways in which you criticize yourself. And getting to know each one of us has a particular way in which we criticize ourselves more than another. And it may be around competency, it may be around ability, it may be about appearance, we may criticize it may be around intelligence. And see if you can bring those criticisms into words. Quite often it's a felt sense. See if you can identify the words that would come with that felt sense. And then ask yourself if you would say that to another person. And also ask yourself if it's true. Quite often those things are not true when they're actually looked at and explored. It's a perception that we have that if we ask somebody else if that were true about us, the other person would probably disagree with us. So creating a self-compassion statement is a great way. It's a little bit like a mantra. If you create a mantra, for example, I am suffering. Suffering is part of life. May I be kind to myself and give myself compassion now. And mantras, as you well know, often bear repeating. So it's not just to say it once, but to sort of find something that works exactly for you. Another one is, may I see my own limits with compassion, just as I view the limits of others. And that one comes from Joan Halifax.
Can you say that again?
Sure. May I see my own limits with compassion. Just as I view the limits of others. And again, that's from Joan Halifax. The other way is to actually take it from the other side of the fence and to emphasize the positive things in your life as a way of balancing exactly what you were talking about, that we're much more geared towards the negative. So it would be things like signing up for the Awakening Joy course that James Baraz does, or keeping a journal of ways in which you contribute to life. You know, things that you know, your strengths, ways in which things that you've done that you really acknowledge are creative. Keeping a journal of daily gratitudes. Gratitude can be a wonderful way of tapping into self-compassion. There's a way in which it tends to open the heart and it can reconnect us with our central core being. So keeping a gratitude journal, even if it's like three things every night you just write down, it sort of attunes you in your life to be aware more of when you're in gratitude rather than in criticism or self-hatred. Noticing when you're kind to others. Where are you generous? Where are you giving? Continue to practice the heart-holding exercise. And spending time with those you love, doing what you love. there's something about, if you live from that place that's truly you, you water the ground of being in that place, and it flourishes.
Can you say that again?
Sure. If you live from the ground of being, if you notice that and you water that ground of being, it flourishes. It's a little bit like, what do you want to flourish in your life? Do you want that place of living from your true authenticity and integrity to flourish? Then notice it. Really pay attention to it. Recognize it. Since some of you are therapists, another way that you can do it is to do gestalt, where in one chair you put the critic, and in another chair you put the person who's being criticized, and in the third chair you put the fair witness. Or actually, you put the critic, you put the person who answers the critic, and then you put the fair witness. And you shift chairs, so you go into the critic's chair and say whatever you would say. And then you go into the chair of the compassionate bystander and answer it from that chair, from the place of self-compassion. And then you go into the chair of the witness by way of giving you more of a context, and notice what it looks like from there. What might the dispassionate observer say? Yeah. Any questions on those?
The dispassionate observer would be the critic?
No, the dispassionate observer is a little bit like the fair witness, or you could think of it as a Buddha figure, or a God, or whatever for you would be someone who is a good witness. Yeah. Yeah. A really, really quick review of the neurobiology of self-compassion. Then I'll just end with a poem. So just give you a snippet of it. You can continue with this in many books on neurobiology. Let's see, what's a good one? I have to think, I'll come up with that in a minute. Actually, John Kabat-Zinn's books are really pretty good at giving an overview of neurobiology, any of his books. He was the founder of the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And so when you're in self-criticism, one of the chemicals that is released is cortisol. And cortisol was really designed for a short-acting, really stressing the body response from the body. It's the fight or flight chemical that comes into being. And so if we have that in our bodies permanently, as we do when we're constantly criticizing ourselves, it's like a low-level, constant level of cortisol. It can really cause undue wear and tear, not only on the blood vessels, but on our immune systems and on our sense of well-being. But there are biochemical changes that come into place. The person who actually made this direct correlation between our emotional state of being and the neurochemicals that were present in the bloodstream at that time was a woman called Candace Pert in her book Molecules of Emotion, which is a wonderful book in terms of making that connection. And she really identified that in fight or flight, cortisol is the one that literally flows really quickly through our bodies and has severe constrictions in our ability to function in an open and flowing way. Whereas when we're in self-compassion, we move from the sympathetic system, which is where cortisol is produced, to the parasympathetic system. And oxytocin is one of the chemicals that's produced in that instance. And oxytocin, you'll all recognize whenever you see a parent gazing at a child with loving eyes, and you can feel that bond, you can feel the limbic resonance, you can feel the connection and the openness and the love that just pours out. So as we move into that place, our bodies relax, all of our systems go into a much more calm, even, open, spacious state of being. And we can function more compassionately, both with ourselves, but also in the world. It's a way of connecting. It's a connecting hormone, or neurochemical. And so there's a health advantage to allowing self-compassion to come into our lives, just in terms of reducing our level of stress and improving the quality of our lives. The other effect of living in a stressful environment is that the ends of the chromosomes, you know, the chromosomes are the items responsible for replicating DNA, cell reproduction. And it is thought currently that chromosomes have a finite number of times when they can reproduce. And optimally, if we're in a calm state of being, they just continue to reproduce, and they reproduce fairly accurately. If we're under continual stress, the ends of the chromosomes have little like messengers on them called telomeres. And if we're under constant stress, they tend to get shortened. And as they get shortened, since they govern the number of times the chromosomes replicate, it can actually lead to premature cell death. And so, again, impinge on our longevity, on our resiliency, on our, the quality of our cells and our muscles. And so it's another added incentive, really, to move into that place of openness, well-being, and self-compassion in our lives. So with that, I'll end. Yeah, your question?
Sure.
Sure, yeah.
There's a question more, thinking that you're in touch with maybe a lot of therapists through the organization and stuff like that, and that you might have a perspective on this. You mentioned earlier about the working for an agency and enforcing the rules and things like that.
Uh-huh.
And I was thinking about when therapists have sort of limitations as to what they can provide. I've heard people say, well, as long as you're upfront about that with the client, then they won't get hurt.
Yes.
And then I think of my own experience as a client at times, and it has felt to me like the part of me that gets hurt is so young that it can't understand. Like if on day one the person says, oh, I'm going to be going on a 2-week vacation,
Uh-huh.
yes, it's been disclosed,
Yeah.
but it's almost like a pre-verbal part. And I just wondered if you hear people debating that at all within the community of, how do you prevent clients from getting hurt by
Yes.
limitations?
Yeah. To say that we do talk about that is true. But it really, there's a way in which, to the extent that we can recognize the level of insult and the level of injury that a client has experienced, we can then take it into consideration and act appropriately and act accordingly. And do things in that instance like, I'm not sure what would be the ways in which we might deal with it. Maybe have somebody else cover for us who the person knows, bring them in maybe 3 or 4 times before they go on vacation, sort of accommodate that level of distress that's likely to come up. Sometimes, unfortunately, it comes up when we have to deal with it immediately, and then it's harder. If that level of injury or insult hasn't been disclosed, then we have to deal with it as best we can in that instance. I don't think there's any way that there can't be disruptions in therapy, simply because we're 2 human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's how those are responded to that makes the difference between whether the therapy really is therapeutic or not. So, does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's not so much that we can prevent them, but how we relate to them. What we do when that comes up is the essence of good therapy.
And I suppose a therapist having a theory that because I've told you you won't be hurt actually blocks them being empathetic to what's really happening, to the wounding that's right in front of their eyes, because their theory says, my disclosure has prevented you from being injured.
That's possible, yeah. if there's, but that would only be if the therapist believed their words and was less attuned to what was happening in the room. And I like to believe that most good therapists are not only saying their words, but being attuned to what's happening in the room physiologically. Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah. So actually this poem is good for, it's a good lead-in. I mean, your question was a good lead-in to it. It's by a guy called Rashani. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerge strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole while learning to sing. And I bring it because, in a sense, bringing self-compassion can feel challenging, and it can bring up aspects of who we are that we don't necessarily like. But to recognize the benefit of it, to recognize the function, to recognize, as one of you mentioned, practice of self-compassion can be a road to learning to sing. So thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.